Yep, let's get started with what is basically our last normal week of the semester, at least. We will have class next week, but there's not going to be any videos or quizzes or in-class activity to do. This is basically the last sort of like graded activities week for the semester. So yeah, we'll finish up today with chapter 11. Most of the final exam is going to be based on chapter 11. My guess is actually the final will be maybe it might even be the shortest exam of the semester as a result, because it's only going to be looking at that one chapter. We'll then talk about chapter 16 next week. That should be more of a sort of fun, light, light maybe, but really fun anyway, sort of a discussion of how we can sort of maybe apply the resources we've been developing in logic to look at the specific topic area, sort of conspiracy theories and extraordinary claims. How can we sort of interpret and examine such claims using critical thinking resources? There'll be a few sort of like conceptual kind of short answer-y questions on the exam about chapter 16, but most of the final exam will be based on what we talk about today. Let's see. Also, let's go through any other businessy stuff. So you all did the chapter 6 exam over the weekend, which is excellent. I'm feeling better enough that I'm slowly starting the grade. So I'm now well behind, unfortunately. So it's going to take a while to get caught up, but I'm beginning to get caught up. I'm probably about halfway done with the chapter 5 exam. Then I'll get to the chapter 6 exam as soon as I get the chapter 5 one done. So that's I think everything I have business wise. Does anyone have any just questions about anything for me? All right, then let's sort of end with our last in-class activity of the semester and sort of talk about chapter 11 a little bit. The reason I wanted to end the semester with chapter 11 is because it's a good overview almost of what we've been talking about this entire semester, why we've been talking about any of this stuff we've been talking about. It's a chance to go back to the beginning and sort of refresh it for ourselves. So the goal of this class was, in a sense, to get better at this idea of inquiry. Right? And what do we mean by an inquiry? We mean trying to figure out what's true because we want to know what's true. And as we noted way back at the beginning of the semester, not everyone does this. Not everyone indeed is interested in figuring out what is true simply because it's true. People oftentimes want to win an argument, maybe, or they want to prove their position is correct or whatever, right? And all of that is really contrary to the idea of inquiry. Our only guide in the idea of inquiry should be this idea of truth. Right? Okay. Now, this is difficult for everyone. It's not that like some people find inquiry easy and others don't. Everyone finds inquiry difficult in various sorts of ways. Mostly in this class, we've been talking about sort of just purely logical mistakes that get in the way of inquiries. Right? Logical fallacies, errors in reasoning, right? Bad deductive arguments, bad surveys, right? Things that for sheerly basically logical reasons can lead us astray, can lead us to not sort of discover truth, to accept bad arguments as if they were good arguments. Okay, fine. But more goes on in why inquiry is hard than just these purely logical concerns. And indeed, they frequently are overlap with psychological, with social, and with cognitive pressures that also make inquiry challenging and make inquiry difficult. And so I figured it would be a great way to sort of like end the semester almost by more broadly contextualizing some of the logical resources we've been developing in terms of other stuff that goes on with human beings. Because I'm sorry if this is shocking for any of you to hear, you're not purely rational beings. None of you purely logical, no Mr. Spock's here or whatever, right? Like, there's more to all of us than logic. And so it's important to recognize these other factors are at play too, because that will make our logic work all the better if we're aware of the other things going on with us. So that's our plan for today, pretty much. We talked about some stuff in the video about how we can sort of go about approaching inquiry for ourselves and all of that. I don't want to repeat myself. What we're going to focus on today are the sort of list of biases that we discussed. Right, so these are very psychological factors. So these are basically features of how we sort of emotionally process the world. Social factors, basically features of sort of group dynamics, how groups work. And then cognitive biases, basically features just how our brains work, how our brains process information. Right? These various features, as we discussed in the video, they are not in and of themselves bad, right? In a lot of cases, these features are actually valuable good, right? If you did not assume that when you touch the hot stove, it would hurt for everyone else just as much as it hurt for you, we would say that's a problem, right? And yet, if you assume that because you had a good experience with poverty, everyone else will have a good experience with poverty, that is a problem, right? Same feature, that's the representative bias, right? Same feature of how our brains process information that can go astray if not sort of checked and not kept in mind. And that's what we're calling these various biases. If you go in Canvas to this, not this week, so this is the week 15 post-class assignment. So this is the one for next week. There's a list of all of the biases that you can sort of download. Also a list of all the fallacies as well that you can download there too. And you might find it helpful in the course of what we're going to work on today to go there, have those ready to hand. Also, when you're doing the homework assignments, and again, also when you're working on the exam, just to have the full list of biases and the full list of fallacies. All right, so I think that's my little preamble for today. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments about anything so far? All right, then let's start working through the activity then. So, all right. So there's going to be two kinds of questions on the exam. The first kind of question is basically just going to be identify what bias is present within some exchange, some arguments, some whatever. All right. And so here we have our number one. Right? This is an example of this first kind of problem. So think of it almost roughly analogous to how you would talk about the fallacies here. So think about that. What you're going to do here is one, define the bias that you think is demonstrated within the argument. And then two, say how this specific exchange manifests that bias. All right, so take a minute to work on number one. And this is a case where frequently more than one of them might work. So how you explain your answer is going to be super important. I'm going to give you the one that I think works best today. But if there's another one bias you want to try out, don't hesitate to let me know. We can try multiple ones and see how they work or how they don't work. All right. So like I said, we can try multiple ones out, raise any other options you want. But the one that seems best to me in this context is the my side bias. So what is the my side bias? The my side bias is our tendency to not really be familiar with why people who disagree with us believe what they believe. Right. And so, in this particular case, right, we have a speaker here who's making this argument who is obviously familiar with various arguments against the existence of God. Right? And indeed, there's a good chance that they're aware of these arguments because maybe these arguments are indeed the reason why this person does not believe in the existence of God. Right? Entirely possible, right? They know why it makes sense to think that God doesn't exist. But they don't know why people who believe in God believe in God. For example, I teach philosophy of religion, teach medieval philosophy, so I know all this stuff. Right? They're not aware of all of the philosophers, the physicists, and theologians who argue that God does exist and who make arguments toward that effect. Right? They're just not aware of it. And as a result of not being aware of these various things, are the reasons why people who don't believe what they believe it. Right? They just assume that people who disagree with them are being irrational in some sense. Right? And that's in this just blind faith part of the argument, right? That I can't imagine why anyone would believe such a thing. They must just be being silly. They must just be being irrational, right? They can't possibly have any arguments just because I kind of don't know what those arguments would be. And so as a result of this bias being present within the argument, this argument can also be characterized as the straw person fallacy. Right? This is indeed not the reason that at least many of those who believe in God would offer. Would not simply be mere blind faith. They would indeed have arguments, and so their position is being misrepresented. But the reason why their position is being misrepresented is because the person just doesn't know why they believe what they believe. All right. So how are we doing with this first problem? Does everyone see how this is an example of my side bias? Do you see what I mean by my side bias? Any questions about what I mean by that? Or did any of you want to try out a different bias at this juncture? All right, if everyone's doing okay, let's go on to number 2. Same thing. All right, here I would say we have an example of the representative bias. This individual is assuming that their experience with poverty is the same experience, is the same as everyone else's experience with poverty. Right? You could say they're assuming their own experience is sort of typical or representative. That's where the name sort of comes from. Again, normally, or in many cases at least, this is an entirely reasonable assumption to make. I assume that all of you also see the sky as blue because I see it. Fine, right? Where this becomes a problem is just when we ignore or overlook people whose experiences are different, then, right? It's great that this person experienced poverty, but yet nevertheless was able to find a good life. But if they thereby ignore people who have had very different experiences with them, right, that's when this becomes a problem. And indeed, again, we can see this argument also, we could characterize it as a logical fallacy. It's also committing the anecdotal evidence fallacy. There's using their own experience as a data point and ignoring all other data points that they have not personally experienced, right? So again, we see sort of like feature of how our brains process information. We just assume everyone's experiences are the same as ours, right? Leading directly into a logical mistake. All right, how are people feeling? Number 2. Again, questions, thoughts, comments? Any other biases you want to try out? You could also maybe try to throw in an identification with beliefs here. That sort of this person seeing themselves as successful in the face of poverty is an important part of how they understand themselves. This is sort of a key part of how this person understands or sees themselves. I don't think identification with beliefs works quite as well here, because the problem isn't so much that they are taking pride in having overcome poverty, The problem here is more that they're assuming that other people would have been able to do the same thing that they did as a result of very different circumstances. So identification with beliefs wouldn't be terrible in this case, but I think representative bias is stronger. Right. Any others? Anything else people want to try out? All right, then let's go to number 3. All right, here I think we've got the inside the box thinking bias. And so why did I go social here? Right, because this seems to be sort of like a social proclamation, right? This is sort of describing, and this is how it always should be, right? That's kind of describing a particular world, the professional world, right? And describing how things are sort of done within that world. That's then describing sort of like the dynamics of that group, right? And so in this particular case, right, our speaker, I got this off of a podcast I was listening to actually, where one of the first major editors for the Washington Post, female editors, was making this claim and sort of arguing that if women wanted to be in the workforce, they needed to be super professional. Right. That's her sort of assumption in this podcast, was that what was traditional within that world, within that group, is sort of the natural or normal thing, and that it doesn't require any kind of justification or defense of why things should be that way. Right? You can imagine someone saying, this is a response to someone saying, I don't think women should have to wear high heels, right? And responding with this response kind of just misses the point, right? It's not getting to the actual issue, which is someone that is challenging the correctness of this tradition. Right? So if you don't see the tradition as needing any sort of defense or justification, you're not going to be able to engage in the right kind of inquiry, where you actually investigate, in fact, whether or not this is the correct or incorrect tradition. All right. How are people feeling with this one? Any, again, thoughts, questions, comments? Number 3. All right, then let's move on to number 4. All right. So here, I think we have the defensiveness bias and a pretty clear case of it, particularly person B in this case, as the person who is sort of guilty of the bias, right? Person B is sort of interpreting person A's critique of their position as a kind of personal attack. And as a result, they're sort of attacking back, right? Rather than actually engaging with the criticism to see if it's a correct or incorrect criticism, right? I mean, and again, we see that as a result, they're committing the straw person fallacy, right? Person A doesn't say, I think you made it all up, right? They didn't say, I think you're a liar and a bad thinker, right? What they simply said was that the evidence doesn't seem to work, right? Their claim was strictly on the level of analyzing an argument, right? The sort of appropriate response to that would either be to defend, if person B tried to defend their position and says, actually, no, I think the evidence does support my conclusion, or to investigate whether or not this critique is correct in the first place, right? Those would be sort of the quote unquote logical responses, right? Those are the responses that are sort of dealing on the level of looking for good reasons to believe what we believe. The defensiveness in this case sort of shuts all of that down and just turns it kind of into a yelling match, a screaming match, right? And again, very clearly in this case produces a fallacy, right? Produces a mistaken reasoning as well as sort of a problematic response that will make inquiry harder. All right. How are we doing here? Good questions, thoughts, comments? All right, then let's go to number 5. All right, here we seem to have an example of what gets called ideological fixity, one of our sort of psychological biases. The sort of stance that person B is taking is sort of like dictated by a very particular kind of ideology. You could call it maybe like sort of a hawkish foreign policy position or something like that, right? That they sort of see it as the right way to respond to international crises is to bomb things, right? And they're applying that ideology, we're told, all the time, right? They apply that ideology sort of willy-nilly, right? They don't apply it in any one specific circumstance, but rather in all circumstances. In a very weird way, that kind of undermines, again, the very idea of inquiry. One way you could start thinking about ideological fixity is this is where you already know the answer before you even ask the question. You see this, I won't name names, right? But you see this all the time if you watch network or cable news shows, let us say, right? There are various personalities that you encounter on these shows, and you know what they're going to say before you sit down to watch, right? Because they always say the same thing, whatever the topic is, right? They sort of, have an ideological stance, and that's all they ever do is just reiterate and repeat that ideological stance. Right? Now, ideologies are not in and of themselves bad, but where this becomes a problem is that ideologies are themselves things that can be investigated and things that need to be investigated. Indeed, whenever someone's asking a particular question, the question is almost always going to be, in a sense, what is the right approach? If you always assume you know what the right approach is, you're just never going to start the inquiry at all, right? You sort of know the answer before you ask the question. That's sort of the danger posed by ideological fixity. And since people aren't usually aware or don't always not recognize their ideologies as ideologies, and so as things that need to be justified, right? They sort of like act as if it's just their ideology is just obviously correct without providing any sort of justification for it, right? So this is sort of a way of short charging or short changing an inquiry, getting it stopped before it even starts. All right. How are you doing with number 5? Any questions here? All right, let's do one last example of a problem of this sort. So let's look at number 6. All right, so I would say we're in the realm of a cognitive bias. Something seems to be wrong with how this person interpreted the study, right? They sort of didn't interpret the study, right? They sort of didn't process the information correctly. That's usually a cognitive bias of some sort. And in this case, I would say we're looking at the overconfidence bias in particular. All right, so the overconfidence bias is where you sort of are more confident that some conclusion is true than is warranted in the evidence. And frequently that takes the form of adopting a more extreme version of some belief when a more moderate belief is actually what the evidence supports. That's very clearly what we see person A doing, right? The evidence does indeed, perhaps, if this evidence, was assume this is correct, I made it up, but assume this was correct, right? The evidence would indeed support the conclusion that that it's probably a good idea to moderate coffee drinks, particularly if you have pre-existing risks, right? I mean, this conclusion was stated very moderately, right? That is indeed supported by the evidence. The conclusion, this cup of coffee will kill you, is not. Right? That is a more extreme version of the thesis that coffee might be dangerous under some circumstances, right? And is sort of a result of this person sort of hearing the result and not sort of hearing the sort of tendency of the evidence in favor of it. And so adopting a sort of more extreme conclusion than is actually warranted by the evidence. With the overconfidence bias, that doesn't always is the case. It's not always the case that someone adopts a more extreme conclusion. It can also occur if someone's sort of like holds a conclusion with a great deal of confidence that they should only hold with a tentative degree of confidence. That's the other time or the other context in which the overconfidence bias appears. This is probably the most common, though. Probably the more common is just to adopt a more extreme conclusion when a more moderate one is what the evidence suggests. All right. So any questions with any of these first 6?
I have a question really quick. So I kind of thought that this could also be rushing to respond or like one of the like psychological biases. Why is it cognitive?
So rushing to respond is, I don't think is terrible here. So anyone still need this? Can I delete this? All right. So yeah, let's look at this with regard to rushing to respond. Right. So the rushing, let's define it. The rushing to respond bias is where you sort of don't take time to properly sort of like analyze and consider before responding. Certainly, I wouldn't say that this is not a terrible answer by any stretch of the imagination. The hesitancy that I have with it as being quite as, I think overconfidence is still a little bit stronger. And the reason why is that this person is not just speaking quickly without thinking. How are they doing that? They're doing that by being overconfident, in a sense, but by adopting the more extreme conclusion. So rushing to respond will almost always be taking place in these examples. If we go back, again, let me just pull back for a second to number 4, sorry. This would be a case where it'd be easier to actually have a whiteboard so I could leave all these questions up at the same time. But so if we go back for a second to number 4, I think you could also here too kind of describe person B as kind of rushing to respond, right? And again, I don't think that would at all be unreasonable. Right? That, again, if you imagine if person B had slowed down a little bit, they probably wouldn't have given this defensive reaction. The reason why I would say defensiveness is better in this case, though, is that the way they're rushing to respond is by being defensive. Similarly, in number 6, same thing. The way they're rushing to respond is by being overconfident. So anyway, is that helpful? Does that work? These rushing to respond wouldn't have been a terrible answer, and I probably would have given you most of the points for it. But it's just not. I think overconfidence is slightly stronger. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Awesome. Good. And let me go back for a second, actually. Yeah, I think really rushing to respond will be the main one of these. I can actually probably just say I'm probably not going to give you one that's purely rushing to respond, because you almost always rush to respond in some way. You rush to respond with some groupthink, or you rush to respond with some my side bias or something, right? So it'll usually, this is probably a really good question. It'll usually be better to characterize rushing to respond in terms of the specific way that the person is rushing, rather than just pointing to it in the abstract. Good. So any other questions with any of those first 6? All right, so when you see problems like that on the exam, remember, basically just treat them like they're sort of analogous to the fallacy problems. Define what the bias is. How is the bias, and how is the specific exchange manifesting the bias or showing the bias? The other kind of problem that's going to be on the exam is like the last 3 problems. So these will be long questions. Here's where you have a lot to write. My guess is, probably 3-4 sentences for the first 6. For the remaining kind of problems, it'll be a lot more. They'll be worth a lot more points, right? This is going to be basically combining our discussion of the biases with our discussion of these biases, of the fallacies. So sort of combining the logical side with the psychological side of what's going on and how people actually think, and try to figure out how it is that we can actually respond when we really see real world versions of fallacies. Because let's just pause for a second. Have any of you ever been like talking to someone and you just responded with like, well, that's just a logical fallacy? Did that get a great response? No, that doesn't get a great response, right? And why not? Because more is going on than just logical fallacies, right? Like, they're not just making a mistake in reasoning. Almost always, our mistakes in reasoning are motivated by one of these various factors, right? By these psychological, social, or cognitive forces. They are usually occurring together. And so actually productively dealing with instances of bad reasoning, frequently, actually, the last thing you want to do is just be like, well, that's a logical fallacy. That's a great way to get punched in the face, right? Like, what you almost, in a lot of concrete cases, will need to do more than that, at least first, is respond to the bias underlying it. Then you can start trying to respond to the actual sort of logical mistake. So let's look at number 7. So for this problem, you sort of have 3 tasks to do. So first thing I want you to do, 1, identify what fallacy is present within the argument. And give like a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of why. Second thing, there's not just going to be a fallacy here. Also identify the bias present within it. And again, give a short little explanation. And then last thing, come up with a response to this argument that responds both to the logical fallacy and to the bias. And frequently, think of this kind of just like a narrative, like write out how would you respond to this person. So all 3 of these, like I said, these are going to be worth a lot more points. I think the probably like 4 points, so about 4 minutes per just identifying the bias question. These questions will probably be like 6 or 7 points, so that means you take 6 or 7 minutes on working on them. All right, so maybe I won't give you that long for right now, but at least take 2 or 3 minutes. Try to sort of do all 3 of these steps. And remember, you can find a list of all the fallacies in this week 15 post-class assignment. In addition to the biases, there's also a complete list of fallacies too. All right, so let's just start with the fallacy. What fallacy do we seem to have here? I would say we seem to have the slippery slope fallacy. The link just from going from attending to the baby every time he cries to therefore the baby's going to end up in jail. Right? That's just a tenuous connection. All right, it would be an extremely bad consequence, but it's sort of an outlandishly bad consequence. And the argument isn't doing anything to really draw the line between those two things. Right? And that was sort of how we sort of characterized the slippery slope fallacy. Notice this is also pretty obvious, right? Like this isn't like a subtle mistake that's getting made. It's kind of a ridiculous claim that's actually being made in a very real sense, right? Okay, but so why then is this speaker finding this kind of ridiculous claim compelling in this particular moment? It seems to be because they're also operating under the availability and vividness bias. We've got this like particularly bad experience in this person's childhood, right? Presumably something that the person sort of like strongly remembers, right? Something that sort of jumps out at them frequently in the course of their life, right? And what they are remembering, of course, isn't exactly the same thing as what's relevant in this case, but nevertheless, they sort of are remembering a spoiled sibling of ultimately ending up in jail, right? Because of having been spoiled in some sense. Right? And that's kind of the only thing that could otherwise make this argument compelling. Is again, the thing about the fallacies is that they're frequently like egregiously bad if you're not like in the sway of whatever else is going on leading you to make the fallacy in the first place. But one could easily imagine this sort of like painful memory constantly recurring to you and making you almost too on guard of spoiling a child. And so if you wanted to sort of respond to this person, just pointing out the fallacy isn't going to be enough. They kind of don't see they're not seeing the fallacy. That's the whole point. That's the whole problem in a certain sense, is that they're not seeing why their argument is committing the fallacy. So what we need to do is sort of address both. And there's lots of different ways of doing this. This is just an example. What you do on the exam might look very different. That's fine. I'm not going to be like grading your narrative acumen or whatever, right? But so here's just kind of an example of the sort of thing maybe that you could say if you want to sort of respond to this, right? Acknowledge the experience. So like, I know that your experience with your brother was very traumatic for you, and I agree we should avoid spoiling our child, right? But just taking care of them when they cry doesn't mean that what happened to their brother will happen to our child, or something like that. Right, as kind of an effort to sort of respond both to the bias but also to the logical mistake. All right, how are we doing here? Is this what I'm looking for in these problems? Does it make sense? Any questions? Okay with the fallacy and the bias that I selected? Any questions about that? All right, then let's look at the next example of a problem like this. Let's look at number 8. So if any of you are fans of The Office, I sort of think of like the person making this argument is Michael Scott from The Office. That's sort of how I've always sort of like imagined this example. All right, so in this case, what's our fallacy, right? It's the red herring fallacy. The manager is just bringing up sort of irrelevant details that distract from the actual issue at hand, which is whether or not the employee should receive raises, right? It doesn't really matter whether or not the company makes a good product or that it's a good company or has good customer service. None of that is really relevant. The actual issue at hand is raises, right? And so bringing up other things is just a sort of a distraction from the real issue at hand. Right? But why is that taking place? And again, I'm sort of imagining like the office here or whatever, right? We seem to have a boss or a manager for whom it's really important that the company and they themselves be thought of as sort of like good people, right? That it's important to this manager that he be thought of sort of as a good boss and that a company is a good company. And that kind of what seems to be motivating bringing up these sort of irrelevant things, right? Things that kind of like are positive things about the company as a way of sort of avoiding and maybe even distracting himself from things that are negative about the company, right? And that this is kind of like some important to this person and how they see themselves in the world. So if we're going to respond to the red herring, which they don't see as irrelevant, we're going to have to sort of show them the irrelevancy of the information that they're bringing up by responding to the underlying bias. And maybe we could do that, right, by something like this, right? But, if the company makes such good products and it has such good customer service, shouldn't the employees be rewarded for all the good work that we do, right? So tying it back in, bringing up the original issue, returning it to the original issue, and yet and sort of also sort of responding to this sense that the company is a good company, makes good products, yada, yada, yada. All right. How are we doing with number 8? Any questions, any thoughts, any other fallacies, any other biases people want to try out? All right. Now let's do one more practice problem. Then we can call, that was not the right button. Sorry. One more practice problem. Then we can call it a day because I know Zoom, at least I'll speak for myself. Zoom is getting rough as we reach the end of the semester. So we'll end it here. So let's look at number 9. Same thing, and then we can end it there for the day. All right. So here we have one of our more recent fallacies, right, from the last exam, in fact, the post hoc fallacy, it seems like. Right? The person is kind of assuming that the bird is the cause of the crash simply because the bird flew by the computer right before the crash took place. But birds are not sort of credible causal candidates for why computer crashes take place. They're not the right kind of explanation for a computer crash. And again, I mean, my hope is that this should seem sort of like obvious to you, right? Like it is obvious a mistake is getting made here, that something has gone wrong. But what's important to recognize is that person A doesn't recognize that they've made a mistake. They don't think that what they're saying is ridiculous. Why not? Why don't they think what they're saying is ridiculous? That's what takes us again to why we have to sort of think of this in terms of the biases that are motivating this. I'd say we also have here an example of the confirmation bias. So confirmation bias, we haven't talked about this one yet today. The confirmation bias is where you sort of only look at evidence that confirms what it is that you already believe, right? And are suspicious of evidence that does not agree with it or sort of argues against what it is that you already believe. Right? And the person's clearly doing that in this sort of second paragraph, I guess, right? Where they're sort of only remembering times when they encountered an animal and something bad happened. Right? They're not thinking of probably all the countless other times that they've encountered animals, but nothing bad happened, right? And so as a result of that, right, that's kind of what's motivating their sense that animals are unlucky. So that should be unlucky to them. And that's where their sort of sense of this is coming from. That's why they don't think they're being ridiculous by drawing this causal correlation. They think all of the evidence available confirms it because they're only looking at evidence that does confirm it. And so if we were to respond to this again, it's not going to be enough just to say that, well, birds don't cause computer crashes, because this person doesn't or kind of does believe that they do. The person is sort of making that mistake. How can we get them off of the mistake? We've got to overcome the confirmation bias. Sorry, my computer is starting to give me trouble. And so, where do we, come on, computer. Let's try this again. Sorry, let me just start. I don't know why my computer has decided to start being difficult. Let's try. All right, there we go. All right. And so in this case, if we wanted to come up with a response, our best approach is probably to respond more from the side of the confirmation bias, to get them to sort of acknowledge evidence of their general claim of things being unlucky, get them to remember non-negative experiences that they've had with animals, right? Then once they sort of are no longer sort of like in the sway of confirmation bias in this instance, once that they will be probably able to pretty readily recognize that therefore they're committing a post hoc fallacy too. All right. How are we doing here? So that's pretty much all I wanted us to go through today. Any questions about number 8, about any of this second set of problems? With the second set, you're going to have a lot more to write, right? The first set's 3-4 sentences. Here, we're probably talking about, 2 paragraphs or so for these longer problems. So any last questions anyone wants to raise? All right. Well, this is the last thing you have to turn in this semester besides the final exam. So congratulations for that. Get this one done. What we'll talk about next week, there will be a few short answer-y kind of questions based on the exam, but the goal of next week is to be a little bit more fun, a little bit let our hair down a little bit, like relax a little bit. I'm not that I have hair really now, but to relax a little bit, right, chill a little bit. We'll talk about just some end of the semester stuff too. And I'll also try to give you some time to do the course evaluations, because I really actually, particularly because we're doing all this weird online stuff, I'd really like to know what you thought worked, what didn't work, going forward, in case I have to sort of do some weird things in the future. So we'll try to do all of that next week, do some good stuff, prep for the exam, and then that'll be it for the semester. So unless anyone has any last things for me, let's call it a day. All right. Have a good rest of your week, and I will see you for the last time next Tuesday. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.